Good afternoon, Richard. Thank you for joining me on this question and answer session. It's good to see you and good to talk to you. And thanks for giving up the time. The last session went really well and we've got a lot of interest. So I think it's a really useful platform to get messages across about what we're doing. Yeah. Starting with my first question is around, goes back to the previous session really. Could you give us an update from the Easter weekend with regard to how you felt the public adhered to the government's COVID guidance? Did they overwhelm the tourist spots, or did they stay away? Or were there any areas of tension where people weren't adhering to the guidance, in your opinion?
What we did see within the control room was a large increase in the number of calls which were COVID related. And of course, it's something that we should be dealing with if they relate to breaches of the regulations. We do try and push, if they're not regulation breaches, issues to the NHS for obvious reasons. We shouldn't be dealing with those types of queries. But by and large, there was a spike and they were relating to breaches of the regs. What we didn't see, I'm pleased to say, was that members of the public were spending time in local beauty spots. They adhered exceptionally well to the guidance when it came to those types of issues. And the majority of the calls that we did see were to private dwellings. So if there were calls which were breaches, they tended to be parties in households, etc. And obviously we engage wherever we can with those involved in those types of activities. But whilst it was a very busy weekend, generally speaking, and a spike in calls, the government adherence, particularly adherence to government guidance, particularly in relation to beauty spots, was exceptionally well observed here in the Cleveland area, just a spike in relation to parties within private dwellings.
Good, that's really good to hear. Could you respond to the guidance that appeared in some parts of the media elsewhere, asking the public to challenge non-compliance themselves as opposed to contacting the police? It'd be useful to know your view and the force's view on this, and give you the opportunity to remind people what they should do if they witness social distancing breaches.
Of course. So we can't prohibit the public dealing with these things for themselves. That's not the role of the police service, of course. It's important that we live in a democracy, and members of the public can do pretty much as they wish unless it's obviously not allowed within the law. But the advice from me and from Cleveland Police is that members of the public shouldn't necessarily deal with breaches of these regulations for themselves and approach people. Doesn't mean that they can't do it, but it is not our advice to do that. Our advice for those people who see breaches, to make sure that they report them to Cleveland Police, and they can do that in a number of ways, as they can for traditional crime type inquiries. So 101, 999 if it's an emergency, of course, or online. But we would generally advise the members of the public don't deal with breaches for themselves, but to phone Cleveland Police and allow us to do that on their behalf. Good,
thank you. There's a whole new language emerging around the COVID crisis, and social distancing is yes. A term that's emerged. I know you've done a lot of good work, and the Force has done some great work around the Clap for Carers initiative and a number of other community initiatives. I think the Force has done really well on the community front. I've picked up here and there occasional comments about, and we've seen it, of course, with the Metropolitan Police in London getting themselves into a real tangle. And I know you're going to be doing the Clap for Carers presumably this week as well. Can you reassure us that our officers are setting an example in terms of retaining that social distance in their own activities?
So dealing with Clap for Carers first, I think it's important to note that the first and primary objective of the police service is safeguarding the public. And if we have time and the availability and the resource to take part in Clap for Carers, we will do that. But that is not the primary focus of Cleveland Police. The primary focus of Cleveland Police is to be there for our communities. Occasionally, if we get the opportunity to be outside a care home, and it is always with the request of the care home, incidentally, or the NHS providers, we don't just pitch up anywhere we like. We do work with those providers in that regard. But that isn't our primary focus. Our primary focus is dealing with incidents as and when they happen. So over the next few weeks, you will see, I think, a slight change in the way that we do things in Cleveland Police. So at 8 p.m. this evening, which obviously is Clap for Carers night again, we have a slightly different approach on a corporate level. And that will be putting out a video that we've pre-recorded in terms of our appreciation to those working in caring industries. That doesn't mean to say that some of our officers and staff will engage with some of our care homes, NHS establishments, of course, because we don't prohibit that from happening. But that isn't the primary focus of Cleveland Police. In terms of social distancing, it can be difficult for the police service to adhere to social distancing all of the time. There are some calls that we attend which require more than one police officer or police staff member to attend, which means sitting in a car together. It's impossible to sit more than 2 meters apart in most of our cars, and so we follow Public Health England advice in that regard. It's the same for arresting, of course. You can't remain 2 meters apart from the person that you're under arrest. There is a requirement for you to make contact with those people. But wherever we can, we make sure that we adhere to the guidance around 2 meters. And for Clap for Carers, we've done that wherever we can also, making sure that our staff members stand apart when they do that and they don't stand together. So there's a very clear message to our workforce. I think they're doing a great job in dealing with the public through this COVID crisis and adhering to the measures for themselves. And Clap for Carers is an important part of our weekly furniture now. But again, it is not our primary focus. It has to be the public and the service we provide to them.
Good, thanks. Moving on, the National Police Chiefs Council, they've produced various forms of guidance, and the most recent version has been picked up by the media and has been the subject of some concern and some criticism about what constitutes reasonable behaviour under the lockdown rules. How is the force interpreting the guidance as it now stands?
So the guidance is provided, like you say, from the NPCC and the College of Policing, and we adhere to that guidance. The guidance is pushed out to all our staff members. There are daily briefings that are provided to all our staff who are very much on the front line and contact with the public. But that guidance does change from time to time, so we've got to make sure that we're on top of that. So as we've discussed before, Barry, there is a command structure within the force, gold, silver and bronze, where those types of messages are passed through. We have a COVID response room here which operates on a daily basis, and any national guidance is received immediately into that team and adhered to within Cleveland Police. We push that out as quickly as we possibly can. And so the guidance issued by NPCC and the College of Policing is what we use here. We don't interpret that guidance for ourselves, and we make sure that our staff are as well informed as they possibly can be. In terms of the tickets that we issued, they are well above what you would expect to see within those guidance in any case, because we engage entirely in the engage focus of the 4 E's approach before we get to any of those more strict guidance or criteria that we can apply. So guidance is on a regular basis changed, and we make sure that we adhere to that wherever we possibly can.
Good, thank you. Cleveland Police are supporting the national You Are Not Alone campaign to remind those people who are suffering from domestic abuse about the support that's available from the police and many other support services, and we've got some excellent ones in Cleveland. What should people do if they are suffering or know someone who's suffering from domestic abuse?
They should do exactly as they always have done. In terms of lockdown and what that means for most people, those that suffer from domestic abuse need to understand that those lockdown criteria do not apply to them. They can leave their home address if they feel that they're in danger, and those loved ones that might be in danger with them. So I would encourage people to do what they've always done, and that is to dial 101, or if it is an emergency, to dial 999. Not all of our victims have always felt across the police service nationally able to call the police, and that is more difficult during this time of lockdown, of course. If they don't feel that they can contact the police directly, they can call Crime Stoppers. They can also contact some of our partner agencies and third sector agencies directly to report concerns, and they can be issued into us here at Cleveland Police via an intermediary as a result. But what I would encourage victims to do is to keep contacting us. We've made sure that as much advice and information is provided to our communities through social media platforms, but understand as well that not everybody carries smartphones or has access to smartphones, particularly if they are victims of coercive control, for example. And so we have posters up in public places, supermarkets, and the response from supermarkets and pharmacies across the Cleveland area has been magnificent, ensuring that victims and those people who may be victims know what they're able to do. And for those that make 999 calls but don't feel able to speak up because of what they're facing there and then, if they're able to dial 55, we know what type of emergency it is and we can dispatch. And so I would encourage people to keep calling us. We have seen a drop in demand across Cleveland during this unprecedented time, and the message we've consistently delivered over the last few weeks is we're open for business. just because we're dealing with COVID-related issues does not mean we're unable to service the demand elsewhere in the police service, which is just as important to us as it always has been. We're there for victims is the overriding message that I want to get across.
Thank you. Enforcement is an issue that's been the subject of some discussion and debate nationally and perhaps to a lesser degree locally. Can the force categorically confirm that you'll introduce fixed penalty notices for COVID breaches? And can you confirm that the details of those numbers of fixed penalty notice breaches are being given out?
Yeah, so the numbers are published on a bi-weekly basis nationally. We saw the last publication of that, I think it was now the week before last, and so the next tranche will be due soon. We publish proactively here in Cleveland because we think the relationship we enjoy with our community needs to last way beyond this COVID crisis, and that people see that we are adhering to the guidance, but also being proportionate in our response to it. So yes, we provide that information to whoever needs it, and to do that proactively. In terms of the categorical reassurance, of course, it is fixed penalties that we issue. As Chief Constable, giving a categoric assurance on anything is difficult because we have staff members out there, of course, who are working hard for their communities and have a degree of self-control over the stuff that they do. But it is fixed penalties that we do issue. There was a period some time ago where we were forced to issue summons as opposed, or report people for summons as opposed to issue tickets, and that was a national problem again, whilst the correct type of tickets were being printed. That is now the case, and it's tickets that we use on members of the public who just won't engage in the 3 E's that come before enforcement. So yes, it's tickets that we use here in Cleveland Police, as they do in all our partners across the country.
Okay, thank you. Personal protective equipment, PPE, is something that's been very much in the headlines through this crisis.
Yes.
Is the force receiving adequate PPE for your frontline staff, you say?
So PPE is a finite resource. This isn't a problem which is confined to the Cleveland area. It's not even a problem which is confined to England or the UK. Each of the countries who are currently battling COVID-19, and that's most of the countries in the world, require their fill of PPE equipment. And because of the finite resource, we're making sure, I know the government are working hard to make sure that all of the PPE that we can procure on behalf, not just of the police service, but all of our emergency services and frontline and care homes as well, is being done. And so in terms of the ability for us to provide PPE, it can on occasion feel like a hand-to-mouth existence on a day-to-day basis. I know, though, through the Local Resilience Forum, the LRF, and the Strategic Coordinating Group, that we're doing all we can to get the PPE where it's required most. And so there will be days where it's less available than others, but I can assure our public that wherever it is possible, we provide our officers with all of the kit that they need. There can occasionally, of course, on a national basis, we know there is a difficulty, and the logistical nightmare that must be getting PPE to all right places right across the United Kingdom must be very difficult. But we're seeing PPE get to where it needs to. There will be days where it's short in some of our agencies, of course, and we manage that through the Strategic Coordinating Group. But generally speaking, the PPE gets to where it needs to be. We want more of it, of course we do, and we want a stock which lasts longer than a day or two. But that is a problem which has emerged right across the world, not just here in the UK. So we're working hard. I've seen it firsthand just how hard the agencies are working to get PPE to where it needs to be. And I'm astonished how well they are doing. And that's just a fight we continue to battle with over the days and indeed, I'm sure, weeks to come.
Yeah, good. I know that this is a challenging area to police, and I know if there's such a thing as a normal day-to-day basis, you're under pressure to tackle all sorts of different crime and disorder in the area. We've now got the additional pressures with the COVID-19 crisis. But we know that vulnerability has to be a priority. And how is the force ensuring that you're still able to provide a service for the most vulnerable people? Is there vulnerability desk still operating, for example, and are you keeping those strands of activity going to help our most vulnerable citizens?
So prior to just as the COVID-19 crisis was emerging, I think we worried not just here in the police service in Cleveland, but nationally and across all emergency services, that the number of staff members that we would see off with who were symptomatic or who were confirmed COVID cases, we thought the number was going to be much higher than it has. it's a testament to the work of our staff that they keep turning up for work and have done so in enormous numbers. The level of commitment we see from them to our communities is astonishing. We are encouraging people who are symptomatic not to be in the workplace, and I know how well our staff are dealing to that, but the numbers are much lower than we anticipated. What that means for people who are vulnerable is that we are able to keep up the level of service that we always have. Yes, we have more people off from the workplace than we generally would have in any other time, but we are still able to staff, for example, the vulnerability desk on a 24/7 basis. It is a real testament to the staff working there and across the service that we've been able to do that. And so I'm pleased to say there's been no change in the service we're able to provide to vulnerable people. And of course, vulnerability takes many forms. That could be members of the public who suffer from a domestic abuse, who might be missing, who are elderly and vulnerable, who are exploited. So the service that we provide to all of those people is just as it was previously. We have seen demand drop, like I say, and we're keen to make sure that anybody who is vulnerable, or if you know somebody's vulnerable, is reported to the police so that we can assist them in any way that we can. But the vulnerability desk, which is particularly what your question regarded, is absolutely still staffed 24/7, and I've been up there this week myself to make sure that the level of service we provide is as you'd expect.
Good. Glad to hear it. In these circumstances nationally, and the criminal justice system is under unprecedented pressure, and we know that there's a significant backlog of cases building up from the discussions we have with our various colleagues in different agencies. Under those circumstances where there's likely to be significant delays in the courts, what arrangements does the force have in place for updating and supporting victims and witnesses which are impacted by these changes?
Well, if the risk presents, the same guidance will be as it was 6 months ago, well before the COVID crisis emerged. If there are current threats, whether that's say sex crime or domestic abuse, exactly the same process will be undertaken. And so there is no change in that regard. And yes, of course, some cases are triaged to make sure that it's appropriate to go ahead, particularly if they're contested cases. And so the guidance issued by the CPS, the protocol, is one which we have implemented here and I know is working. Incidentally, earlier today, I did speak personally to the Chief Crown Prosecutor for the area to make sure that as two agencies, we felt that the working together was as good as it possibly can be. And I'm really sure that it is. It's important, I think, that people at the strategic level, that's me and the Chief Crown Prosecutor, do talk on a regular basis, but also those working in the Magistrates Court Service or the court service more generally interact with our head of crime, for example, to make sure that, if possible, officers are able to give evidence remotely, victims are able to do the same, and that the court system runs as well as it possibly can be. We will see that emerge, I think, or develop rather over the weeks to come, as we see slowly at some point, of course, we will emerge out from lockdown and that the system will be back up and running. You'd be pleased to hear that internally to Cleveland Police, but it isn't just internally, we look externally as well. There's a recovery group which has already started, and part of the work of the recovery group is to make sure that issues such as backlogs in court systems and crime is addressed. And so work is already underway before we emerge from lockdown to make sure that when we are up and running, we are back up and running quickly. But the protocols of the CPS seem to be working well, and that's a discussion I had earlier today.
Good. I was pleased to hear that, because I was going to ask about the CPS charging protocol. What I'm particularly interested in is how we're implementing and managing this with the CPS in respect of domestic abuse and sexual violence related cases, because they're obviously much more sensitive and people are much more vulnerable in those scenarios.
Yes.
Are you confident that arrangement is working in those circumstances?
Well, we're as confident as we can be. The risks and challenges around COVID make these things much more difficult than normal. And so categorical assurance is something which is difficult to provide, of course, because there will always be an exception that proves that rule. But all of the agencies I know are working as hard as they possibly can to make sure that the service to victims is as good as it can be in these unprecedented times. But as well as the court system, there are other safeguarding measures that we do take in the police service for those court cases which will now inevitably take longer than we want them to. So DVPNs are still being used to make sure that we offer some protection to victims of domestic abuse in particular. But we're also using bail more than we necessarily would have before to make sure that there are some control systems around potential offenders. And so there are a suite of tactics available to us that we are employing to make sure that any problems associated with the court system are somehow lessened or mitigated by the other means open to us. And so we're very alive to the types of risks that might be emerging because of the fact that court cases aren't running through the system as quick as they would in normal times.
Understood. My last question around the CPS and charging. There is, as part of that new protocol, there's a paragraph in there that talks about where suspects are issued with postal requisitions or summonses. They should be given a court date 84 days after the date of issue. That's 12 weeks. Do you think that's a realistic deadline? And how is the force playing its part within the bail system and the process generally?
So that's managed by the bail managers. So we have people working on that on a daily basis in any case. So we're doing what we can to make sure that we adhere to that guidance. Any problems that do start to emerge, I know the CPS and the police service are on the phone to each other on a regular basis, and those issues can be surfaced and discussed. There are no major issues that I think we're seeing in relation to that protocol at this stage, none at least that have been brought to my attention. But that is something which is very much under the focus of the head of crime and is a focus for those bail managers on a daily basis. So we're doing what we can to make sure that we adhere to that guidance. But again, it is worth reiterating, these are national problems that the whole police service are trying to tackle with at the moment. But I know Cleveland Police is doing a good a job as anywhere else in terms of trying to adhere to those timescales.
Sure. And final question on criminal justice. We've got, as you know, we've got Crown and Magistrates Courts. We've got witness care units that work in those courts to help and support those victims. In the current crisis, are you becoming aware of any particular issues or delays or barriers under that to work this system under the current crisis?
So we're not seeing any impact in that regard. I say that tentatively because things do change, of course, as circumstances change. But at this stage, we're seeing no impact in that part of our work in terms of care unit and witness care. What we've done to assist in that regard is to make sure that we have temporary staff in there to assist with the resourcing. We understand how important it is to keep victims and witnesses up to date on the progress of the cases in which they're involved. It is incredibly stressful to be involved, or can be incredibly stressful to be involved in court cases. And I think updates from the police service on behalf of other agencies as well is something which ensures that we reassure those people as much as we possibly can. But I'm pleased to say at this stage, there's been no impact on our ability in that regard. And of course, we've been proactive to make sure that the staff are available there to do that. So currently, I'm happy with the way that that's managed.
Okay, thank you. A couple more questions and then a final question from the member of the public. These two questions have emerged fairly recently. First one's around rights of way. You'll know that we've got a rural fringe on the outskirts of the Cleveland area. We have had a complaint from a farmer about police. Sorry, not police, about public putting them at risk by the numbers of people who are going along the rights of way. Do you have a view on enforcement around rights of way? I'm presuming we're going to keep them open, but any views or any common sense suggestions from members of the public who want to go out to these rights of way if it's appropriate to do so?
Well, there's a balance to be struck because it is important, I think, that we all continue to take our daily exercise, not just for our physical health, but mentally that has an enormous benefit as well. It is difficult on rights of ways to ensure that you keep to the 2-meter rule. Some of these rights of ways can be quite narrow in focus. And so I would ask people wherever they can to ensure that they adhere to that 2-meter rule. In terms of the sheer numbers of people who attend to some of these places, I know how difficult that can be to manage. But in terms of enforcement in that regard, we adhere to that 4 E's where we start with engagement and encourage people wherever they can to take exercise from their front door, if they can do that. We understand, of course, that isn't always possible, and the guidance does change from time to time from the PCC. So it is the same regardless of where you are, whether you're walking on a pavement in a built-up area with traffic being an issue, or whether you are out in more rural areas. It is important that we keep up in that regard. Please keep 2 meters apart and ensure that those guidance are adhered to. So we understand the difficulty. We understand the difficulty that can provide for some of our more rural communities and farmers in particular. We have a rural crime team here, and we make sure that we engage wherever we can with our farming and agricultural community to ensure that we see where some of those issues are. But inevitably, where people exist, there will be tensions in terms of use of land, etc. And we will do all we can to manage those tensions as opposed to move to enforcement.
Good. Thank you. Much appreciated. We started off this session talking about Easter and arrangements for Easter. As you'll be aware, today's the start of Ramadan. How will the force be tailoring their activities to recognise this is an important time for people and families of this faith? And how are we operating the services that you provide to this community in these challenging times?
Yeah, where we are, Cleveland Police are the police service to the whole community in Cleveland. And this is an incredibly important time in the Islamic faith, of course. And we will do all that we can to ensure that they are able to adhere to the teachings that they do for issues around Ramadan. So our approach will be as it has been every year, which is engagement. I'm aware that the Muslim Council of Britain has put some guidance out on how Ramadan can be observed during these unprecedented times of COVID-19. And I would encourage communities and the Muslim community in particular to pay regard to some of those issues in terms of praying at home as opposed to mosques, which remain shut, of course. And so our response will be as it always has been, which is engagement and understanding that this year will look different. But it was the same for other religious festivals that we've had over recent weeks, whether it's the Sikh festival, the Christian festivals. Yeah. It is engagement and making sure that we are all able to enjoy those festivals as best we can during what are, I know, difficult times. So it's business as usual for us in terms of policing, all faiths or those of no faith.
Good. I'm pleased to hear that. And business as usual is also working for a safe and tolerant community as well. And I know in Cleveland, we are home to many, many different communities. And I think it's great that we're able to live alongside each other and respect each other. And I'm sure you would want to associate yourself with that. And I know it's the approach that the police take.
Absolutely.
Day-to-day work. The final question is a difficult one. It's come from a member of the public, and it's quite a long question, but I'll try and sum it up very briefly. And it's about proportion, and it's sometimes, and you will have come across this as well, there are some people within the community who might say you're being too soft in terms of your enforcement activity. There'll be some people who will say you're too overzealous in terms of your enforcement activity. This is a difficult question, but how do we strike the right balance?
Well, we strike the balance through scrutiny. We scrutinise our own records on a daily basis to make sure that we feel that the tickets, for example, that are issued are proportionate. And I'm pleased to say that I think they are proportionate here in Cleveland Police. We do not jump in with tickets, far from it. And in terms of the national results that were published the week before last, I was delighted to see where Cleveland were. We were not amongst the forces that issues most tickets. They will have had their reasons for doing that, of course. Neither were we towards the bottom of that list of those who issue next to no tickets. That is no criticism of any other police force. The circumstances pertaining in that area will dictate the requirements. And here in Cleveland, I think we've struck a reasonable balance between the two. Our officers and staff issue tickets in the very rarest of circumstances when we police a population well in excess of 500,000 people in what is a small geographic area. I'm very proud of the work that officers and staff have done in that regard, and I know that they issue with proportionality, and we know that because the amount of scrutiny that we do, and as Commissioner, you're very welcome to scrutinise for them those tickets for yourself at any point. When we published the data alongside the national data a couple of weeks ago, we were careful as well to provide some examples of the type of things that people had issued tickets for. We had a couple of members of the public who'd travelled a significant distance from outside of the force area to purchase a dog. Others who were congregating in large numbers despite the guidance in public areas against the guidance. And so we provided some examples of where we issue tickets. And that, I think, had a degree of reassurance for the public and an understanding as to where the threshold here in Cleveland Police was. I think we've struck a remarkable balance in that regard, but it is an ongoing piece of work as we work our way through the following weeks of lockdown, which are ahead of us, of course.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much, Richard, for taking the time out. I really welcome the opportunity to raise questions and concerns on behalf of the public, and it's part of my responsibility, and it's obviously your responsibility to answer those questions.
Absolutely.
And I'm really grateful you've given up the time this afternoon. So let's continue to work together to keep the Cleveland area safe, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Barry.